Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is week 3 of the session. And so, just to remind everybody where you should be in the online and hopefully give you guys an opportunity if there's anyone on who is having any trouble logging in to the online course. Now's a good time. So, let me know and we'll try and correct that problem. The You should pretty much be getting into chapter 4 at this point. The idea here is to review chapter 4 and get into a little bit of chapter 5. Um, the chapter 4 is basic electricity. And then chapter 5, we start getting into the component pieces of the solar system. So the logic there is chapters 1 through 3, very foundational stuff. Now, chapter 4, also foundational, but a lot of you, you may have good background in electrical. If you do, great. If you don't, it's not necessary. We're going to try and just get you up to date with the kind of electrical information that you need in order to be successful here. Solar is essentially an electrical trade. Some people come into this class and all they know about electricity is don't stick a fork in a socket. You know, that's bad. Other people come in and they've wired their own house. They've done electrical work for a long time and have a pretty good understanding. So electricity, the first and foremost thing to understand is the relationship between watts and amps and volts. So that's something. I'm getting my little pad here in case I want to use the whiteboard. So the first equation, and there are really only 3 equations that you need to have memorized as part of this process. I think they're pretty simple equations. The first one is the power equation, and that is watts equals amps times volts. So let me go ahead and share the whiteboard. Okay, as soon as it loads there, preparing still. All right, so hopefully you guys can see the whiteboard there. So when we talk about this, watts equals amps times volts, we're really just using the power equation here. It is the numerals that we're using, watts with the W, I for amps. It's the French for intensité de courant, and then volts. Sometimes you'll see this written P equals I times E. And the little saying there is electricians like pi. It's the same equation. It's power equals amps times electromotive force. So they're just giving slightly different terminology to the same exact. Throughout the book, we'll be talking in watts, amps, and volts. So that's the power equation. So where does this come in to play? Well, let's say that I've got a 60-watt light bulb and I know my household current is 120 volts. So how many amps would it take to run that light bulb? Well, you do the math and you figure it out, and it's actually I is 60 watts divided by 120 volts. So it's going to be half an amp. Okay, well, why is that important? And notice when we put a number there, we put it with an A instead of an I. So now with that number, if I've got a 20 amp circuit on a circuit breaker, I know that I could hook up 40 of these light bulbs before I would pop that circuit breaker. When I hook in the 41st, in theory, that 20 amp is going to be exceeded and now it's going to pop. So that's something that you run into, quite a lot, is just trying to figure out how many amps. So if we have 2 of them, we know what the third one is. Okay, so that's the relationship there. Since I'm hitting equations, the other equation that we deal with, very similar, is Ohm's law, Ver. Volts equals amps times resistance. So amps times resistance, well, the water analogy with power works pretty well to understand how power works. If I say that watts is the amount of water flowing through a pipe, amps is the size of the pipe, and volts is the pressure that the water is under. So a small pipe with high pressure will generate the same amount of water as a big pipe with low pressure. So there's that relationship. Well, if we extend that analogy, then resistance would be the friction that the water feels as it moves along the interior of the pipe. Well, what happens over distance as that water flows through and it's receiving friction from the side? Well, it slows down a little bit, right? It will impact the pressure, but it won't affect the size of the pipe. Pipe's going to stay the same. So resistance is primarily going to be a factor that affects voltage. But the relationship is still there. So volts equals amps times resistance. This is just known as Ohm's law. And where we bring it into play is when we do voltage drop. And let me see, how do I erase this? Nope, that's not what I wanted. All right. Still trying to figure out how I erase this page here. Nope. All right. I'm probably just not seeing it. All right, I'll write up here in this corner. So voltage drop equals amps times resistance times twice the distance divided by 1,000 feet. So that is a variation of Ohm's law. So why are we making this variation? When we're figuring out over a length of wire, let's say I've got a wire that starts at my solar array and it terminates at my DC disconnect. That's usually the longest piece of wire. So it's up on the roof or it's out in a field, and now it's going to be running all the way to the house. So let's say that that is 150 feet, say, of wire. And I want to figure out how much voltage I've lost from the time that the power leaves the array to the time it arrives at the DC disconnect. So that's known as voltage drop. There is going to be some loss. It's the same as like friction of the pipe as it goes over a distance. So the factors that are going to affect how much power is lost are primarily how many amps are there? What size wire do you have? Because the bigger the wire, the less the resistance. And then what's the distance? So those are the three aspects that we have. So if I want to take voltage drop and I want to figure it out on this example, and let's say that my amps, remember the amps on a single panel are going to be the amps for the whole string, because when you hook things up in series, voltage goes up, but amps remain the same. So if I've got a solar panel with, say, a 9.35 amp IMP, and I hook up 10 panels in a string, well, then the amps of that string is still 9.35 amps. So I'm going to just use that as an example. And now I take the resistance. Well, where do I get my resistance number? The helpful thing that the National Electrical Code does is it publishes the resistance of all wire in a little table. And in your book, that table is on page 80 something, I think, if I remember right. I'll look in here. Yep. Page 92. Is that right? No, page. Yeah, AWG. Yeah, on page 92. So if you look there, and let's say we're using 10 gauge wire, number 10 gauge wire, stranded copper, it's 1.24 ohms per 1,000 feet. So the reason we have to modify Ohm's law is because we're given resistance per 1,000 feet. So I know that my resistance is 1.24 ohms, but it's per 1,000 feet. So what portion of 1,000 feet do I have? Well, I said that this run was 150 feet. So I multiply 150 feet by 2. Why do I multiply it by 2? Is because the electron is traveling a circuit. So it goes there and it comes back. So the resistance is going to affect it for the entire circuit. So 150 feet times 2 is going to be 300. Divide 300 by 1,000, you're going to end up with 0.3. So the math is pretty easy there. So it's 0.3. So now I would just take 9.35 times 1.24. I'll use my calculator here. 9.35 times 1.24 times 0.3. And I get 13.02. So what is that telling me? It's telling me that the voltage drop is 13.02 volts over that distance. I'm going to see if there's got to be a way of erasing this. All right, I guess I can just add a page. What? Oh, okay. All right, so if my voltage drop, what did I say? 9.35 amps times 1.24 ohms times 0.3, which is 150 times 2 divided by 1,000. And we ended up with 13.02. 02 volts. Why volts? Because Ohm's law says volts equals amps times resistance. Well, that's what we just did. So is that acceptable? Is it acceptable to have 13 volt loss over that distance? Well, it depends. It depends on what the voltage was of your array, of the system. So if it was a 12 volt system and we're losing 13 volts, well, that's not acceptable. We just lost all of the power from the time it left the array to the time it got to where we were sending it. There's nothing there. Now, that's one of the reasons why Tesla and Westinghouse won out over Edison when it was the battle between DC and AC current. Is back in the battle of the current days, there was a big contest. They were wanting to take power from Niagara Falls and get it to Buffalo, New York. Well, that was 90 miles, something like that. So how do we get the power from Niagara Falls and get it to Buffalo without losing all of the power along the way? Well, with DC, you had to have regeneration stations every, mile or two. But with AC, you could use a transformer and increase the voltage. So if we start out at 12 volts and we lose 13, well, too bad, so sad. You just lost all your power. But if you start out, if you can ramp up the voltage, let's say to 70,000 volts, and you lose 13, nobody cares. It's such a tiny percentage of the power that's lost. So this is one of the reasons why in our electrical grid, we have the power that leaves the power plants is typically going to be ramped up to about 70,000 volts. And it's going to travel along those high transmission lines that you see out along, highways, the ones that are very tall. And it's going to come to a substation somewhere near the city, somewhere in the city. And those are those fenced off areas with lots of transformers and the like. Well, in there, it gets stepped down, and typically it's stepped down to about 7,000 volts. And then it travels along all the power lines that you see along the roads in your city at about 7,000 volts. And when it gets to the canister that's on the telephone pole next to your house, it's stepped down from 7,000 volts down to 240 volts, and it comes into your home. Well, if it had started off at the power plant at 240 volts, voltage drop would have eliminated all of it, or at least a healthy proportion of the power between where it was generated and where it was received. So by using transformers, stepping them up and then stepping them down, you can avoid the impact of voltage drop. So the higher the voltage of the system, the less impact voltage drop has on your system. which is one of the arguments in favor of going to 1,000 volts or 2,000 volts or 1,500 volts or whatever in these systems, is because voltage drop becomes less and less of an issue. But here in the US, we've decided 600 volts is what we want at the residential level. And I keep thinking that's going to change, but so far it hasn't. I think there's an embedded manufacturing base that would just as soon not have that change. So that's why we're dealing with some of that. Okay, so that's that item. Any questions on voltage drop or those three equations at this moment? You guys are also good at sitting here quietly in meetings, so I would rather that you didn't. We can have you guys get obnoxious with all sorts of questions. All right, so one of the issues, I'm just looking through chapter 4 here to see, there is some discussion about single phase and three phase. Don't worry too much about that. Single phase is what you're going to be using mostly in a residential setting. And single phase, we refer to here in the United States as single phase split phase, where the utility is going to be generating 240 volts of electricity coming into your home. Line 1 is going to carry 120 volts, and line 2 is going to carry 120 volts. So if you were to measure between line 1 and line 2, you're going to measure 240 volts. If you measure between line 1 and the neutral, it's 120, and between line 2 and the neutral, it's 120. Without getting too crazy about it, these signals are coming in 180 degrees out of phase with each other, which basically means when one is at its peak, the other's at its trough. And that's just to keep them from mixing up with each other, to get into a harmonics issue. So that's just how that works. Three phase has three signals coming over the wires on three different hots. And the reason you need to be aware of that for this level is the primary three phase that you might run into in a small commercial enterprise is going to be 208 volt 120, which basically means if you measure between any of the hot lines and the neutral, you're going to get 120 volts. But if you measure between any of the two hot lines, you're going to get 208 volts. Well, I say that because sometimes you're going to see inverters marketed and it'll say this is a 240 volt inverter or this is a 208 volt inverter. Well, if it's 208 volts, you know it's three phase. And if you're installing in a residential, you probably don't want to buy that one because it's not going to be for what you're doing. So just be aware. There are different flavors of three phase. There's 480, 277. That's for larger commercial properties, different color codings on the wire. But we don't have to go too deeply into three phase just to know it exists. Be aware of it. We talk about circuits, open circuits, closed circuits. A closed circuit is a light switch that's turned on. So if you think about it, you're closing the connection so that the electrons can flow through the wire. When you open it, it's like leaving the gate open. The things can't go around the wire. So open and closed circuits, pretty straightforward. The other thing that you just have to kind of internalize, and hopefully this isn't a problem for folks, is when you hook up power sources in series, meaning positive to negative, voltage increases, amps remain the same. When you hook it up in parallel, amps increase, voltage remains the same. So a parallel connection is positive to positive, negative to negative, right? Series is positive to negative, positive to negative. If you have trouble remembering that, the one little device I use is there is an A in parallel. So parallel affects amps. That might help you, but again, it's not that hard to remember. So then, of course, there's the voltage, the Ohm's law triangle. So remember, the relationship there is volts equals amps times resistance. So if I just do this, if you don't like algebra, um, they usually will have it like just put it in a triangle like that. And you say volts equals amps times resistance. And they'll usually just mark it like that. All right. So if we're solving for this, it's going to be that times that. If I'm solving for resistance, it's going to be V over I, or volts divided by amps. If I'm solving for amps, it's going to be volts divided by resistance. So you can just look at it and see what is the equation that we're going to be solving for without having to figure out the algebra. So that's all. The same thing could be done for watts equals amps times volts. It's just putting the 3 in there, and it just helps you if algebra is not your strong suit. American wire gauge, that's how we measure our wire. I've said 10 gauge, 12 gauge, 14 gauge, whatever. It's a weird system. It's, in retrospect, it's really dumb. The bigger the number, the smaller the wire. Okay, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So 22 gauge wire is a lot smaller than 2 gauge wire. Well, you would think it would be the opposite, but that's just now the way that this came about. My understanding is back in the day when they were making wire, they'd have a blank, right? And the blank was just considered 0. And then they'd pull it through a gauge, a smaller hole, and that became 1 gauge wire. And if you pulled it through another smaller hole, it became 2 gauge, 3 gauge. The more gauges you pulled it through, the smaller the wire got, because you couldn't pull that blank through a 3 gauge wire. It had to step itself down in the manufacturing process. So if it went through 22 gauges, it got really small because it stepped down through 22 sequentially smaller holes when it was manufacturing. So that's the logic behind it, if that helps you. But most of the world doesn't measure wire that way. America's the only one who does, which is why we call it the American wire gauge. Most of them just measure it in square millimeters. It's just based on the size of the wire. So you'll see it referred to it that way, but we'll constantly be referring to it as AWG, as wire gauge. One of my rules of thumb when you're selecting and designing a system, do not use any wire smaller than 10 gauge wire, right? You're allowed to, but don't do it. It solves a world of problems if you just stick with 10 gauge wire or bigger wire. There's a number of caveats within the NEC, within the code, that says, okay, if you're using 12 gauge or smaller, you got to do this and you got to do that. Well, you avoid all of that if you just use 10 gauge wire. You don't even have to worry about it. But the reality, and I know I can't even count how many times I forgot to do something. I forgot to account for heat or exposure to sunlight or something like that, or we added a panel later or something like that. And because you went with a bigger wire, not a problem. Otherwise, you would have had to pull the whole thing. And the only difference between 12 gauge wire, for example, and 10 gauge wire for a solar install might be $50. So why are we worrying about it? Let's just spend the extra little bit of money, put in the bigger wire, and be done with it. That's just my rule of thumb, is never use anything smaller than 10 gauge wire. It's not worth it. That said, sometimes your panels are going to come with 12 gauge wire most of the time. Well, you can't do anything about that. So the first connection to the combiner box is still going to be 12 gauge. Okay. But from that point forward, there may also be some sensor wires that are smaller. Again, don't worry about that. But if you're selecting the wire, 10 gauge or bigger. Let me see. Anything else? We talk a little bit about, the rule of thumb for voltage drop is I try and keep my voltage drop for my system somewhere down around 2%, certainly no more than 5%. So remember in our example when we were at, 13 or 14 volts, I said if it was a 12 volt system, we lost all of our power. Well, what if it's a 100 volt system? well, then we've just lost 13%. If it's 600 volt system, so if I say 14 divided by 600, we just lost a little over 2%. So that's about the most I would want to do. So so what are your options? Let's say that I don't like that. I don't want to lose 2.5% just on that one segment of wire because I don't want to lose more than 2% over the whole run. Well, your options is shorten the distance. We said it was 150 feet. Normally, you want to keep it as short as possible anyway. That's just good design. You don't want to be spending money you don't have to. So hopefully your distances are as short as they have to be. You can't really shorten the distance between the roof and the basement if that's where you're putting your equipment. So the distance is what it is. Sometimes you just have no control over that. But if you do, certainly make your runs as short as possible. The other thing that you usually have control over is the size of the wire. So get bigger wire. If you get bigger wire, then the amount of resistance is going to be diminished, and then the voltage drop is going to be diminished. So use bigger wire. And if you're designing a system for a roof, I always like to design it as if the entire roof was filled up with solar panels. So if you say, okay, this array that we're putting on the roof is only taking up half the space on the roof, so that's the size wire I need, I would still design it with the bigger wire as if I filled up the whole roof. That way, if we do add panels in the future, all the wire is in place. You don't have to worry about pulling all that wire and putting in new wire, which can be very, very expensive at some future date. So let's say that you could get by with 10 gauge wire, but if you put in, say, 6 gauge wire, that would handle the entire roof space if you filled it up with solar panels. Well, that's great. Now wire it with 6 gauge wire. The downside is maybe it's going to cost you $200 or $300 more to do that. So what I would do is talk to your customer and say, listen, this is my recommendation because it's going to cost you $200 more. But if you decide to expand this thing in the future, it's going to save you thousands of dollars in work, and if they're smart, they'll say, yeah. But if they're really price sensitive, they might say no. Well, you don't want to automatically do it and price yourself out if it's a competitive bid situation. You don't want to make a really good design that's really future proofed and the competitor is just doing the bare minimum and you lose the job because you came in $1,000 more, or $500 more or whatever. So sometimes I would give two bids. This is the bare minimum, but this is what I recommend, based on future. And oftentimes the client is going to go, well, I don't see us using more power in the future. I just don't see it expanding. Our kids have moved out, whatever. And then you go, oh, well, have you thought you might buy an electric car in the future? If you do, that's going to, double your electric. So there's a lot of things that could happen. And, it depends on how good a salesman you are. But it really is just good. If you're doing it for yourself, design it so that, you're maximizing that roof space. Grounding and bonding is another area that's at the very end of this chapter, grounding and bonding. And grounding and bonding, if you get dinged by the inspector, this is one of those things in the world today when you're installing a system, typically you have to have the electrical inspector come and inspect your system before you can close up the trench or before you can get permission to operate or send it off to the utility for permission to operate. The grounding and bonding is where they're going to ding you. And largely because they don't understand solar. When we've had inspectors come on job sites, we have to explain what solar is to them. They're out there telling us if we did it right and we're going, well, this is how it works. This is what we do, and they don't understand it at all. So, but they do understand bonding and grounding. So oftentimes they feel like, oh, I made the trip, so I need to find something. That's always annoying, but it's somewhat human nature. So Sometimes I like to give them something to find, something easy to fix. Like you put the wrong little nut on the ground rod or something, and they say, "Oh, we don't like that one. We want you to use the other one." And we're like, "Oh, yeah, I happen to have one in my pocket. Sure, I'll do that." So then you can fix it and you're done, or whatever. Just give them something. Especially if you get to know the inspectors, and they're just, there's always that thing about the inspector is God, and so let them be a deity for a day. So anyway, that's the issue. So grounding and bonding, it's a safety issue. It's a big deal. But I read a lot of books about grounding and bonding when I was first studying this, and everybody tried to make it out to be so complicated. I don't think it is. I think at its heart, basically what you're saying is anything that's made of metal can carry electricity. Sometimes electricity gets to the metal bits when it's not supposed to. If there's a short, if there's a burr, a hole in the wire insulation or whatever, something's happening. So these bits that aren't supposed to be energized are energized. And so I want to give it a pathway to the ground that is not me, because you can walk up and touch something, and now you've created this pathway to ground, and all this energized power is now flowing through your body. So you want to give it a pathway to the ground. And I'll give you an example of something that happened to us. We had in our farm, we had stainless steel cabinets in the kitchen. And my wife came to me and said, something's wrong with the microwave, because when I touched it, I got a shock. And so I was like, well, she's technologically challenged, let's say. So I never quite believe these things until I look at them. So I was like, well, is it like a spark, like a static electricity discharge or something like that? And she goes, no, like it hurt. So I went up and I touched the microwave, and I'm touching it with the back of my hand, and because you don't want to lock on if there is power there. And there was nothing, I'm touching everything. Nope, nothing. I don't see anything, nothing wrong. So then she came back and said it did it again. And so I went over and I touched it again. Nothing happened. Well, then later I touched something in it and I got shocked. Well, now it was real because it happened to me, right? So it turned out, what had happened? Well, it wasn't the microwave. The microwave was fine, but we had an electric tea kettle that we had used for years and years and years. One of those things you just set on the counter and you push the little tab and it boils water. Well, because it had been moved around so much, the wires on the bottom of it had worn through, and so the hot wire was touching the metal counter. So the entire counter was electrified, right? It had 120 volts of electricity all the time, just like it was a live wire. So when she touched the microwave, it gave her a shock. It carried the voltage through her to the ground. Her connection to the ground, she was wearing leather sandals, wasn't great. So it wasn't like a full shock, but it was enough. Well, I was wearing tennis shoes, so I was insulated. So when I touch it, nothing, because I'm insulated from the ground. So, but if there had been a child, coming up, a toddler, and running up in bare feet and slobbering and touching this electric countertop, that child could have been electrocuted, right? Because there's a live wire. The whole kitchen counter is live. Well, you don't normally think of your kitchen as something you have to bond and ground. But when you're dealing with electrical stuff, there are boxes, switches, conduit, racking. There's lots of metal there. And if somehow electricity is touching that metal, then when you go up and touch it, you could be that pathway to the ground. So you want to tie or bond all of the metal bits together and then ground it by running a metal conductor, a copper metal conductor, to the ground. That's where we get bonding and grounding. So you're basically bonding all the metal bits together so there's one circuit, and then providing it with a good, clean pathway to the ground so that I'm not the pathway to the ground. Well, then you connect it to your neutral wire, because that is the bonded conductor. And in your system somewhere, it's looking and saying, hey, if electricity is in the grounding system somewhere, let's just shut everything down. That's known as ground fault protection, right? Because there should never be electricity in that grounding system. If there is, something's wrong. I remember I used to look at that, and you'd see these bare copper wires going down there to the ground rod or whatever. And as a kid, I would go, God, why isn't somebody electrocuted? You'd think that they should put insulation on that. Well, they don't have to because it should not be energized. If it is, something's wrong. So that's bonding and grounding in a nutshell. Bond all the bits together and give it a pathway to the ground. Because something always goes wrong. In any system, something always goes wrong. So what is the thing that goes wrong most of the time with a solar array that causes a ground fault? There are really two main things. One is wires are getting pinched somewhere and it simply rubs through the wire and you make an electrical connection. But the other are squirrels, right? Squirrels love to chew on wire. And as soon as they get in there and chew on a wire, you get a ground fault and you're going to go out and find some dead squirrel hanging by its teeth on your solar array. And, hey, there's the problem. So that's bonding and grounding in a nutshell. And obviously, like I can teach you the moves of chess, but it takes a long time to master the game. Bonding and grounding, simple in concept, but it can be tough to get right. And these inspectors love to find something. I mean, engineers, if you guys are an engineer, you probably know it if you're self-aware. Engineers love to show you how smart they are. They love to have some obscure little fact and, oh, I'm a smarter engineer than you, and I'm going to tell you this. So that's what inspectors do. They just want to tell you, I knew this thing, I read this thing, and now you didn't violate, so I want you to fix it. So, everybody tries to out-engineer each other. That's fine. Just let them. Try and correct it. Okay, any questions about chapter 4? Chapter 4, the electric. Okay. Okay, so chapter 5, really this week we just want to get you introduced to it, but logically as you go through this chapter 5, the idea is I always like to logically, in order of equipment, start at the array and work my way backwards until you get to the load. So it would go the array, then the combiner or the junction box, then the DC disconnect, then the inverter, then the AC disconnect, then you get to the service panel, from the service panel to the meter, the electric meter, and then to the grid. So if you're wondering why the sequence is the way it is, I'm looking at it sort of left to right. That's logically how I like to look at it. That doesn't always work because now we start adding in new bits of equipment here and there. And some systems don't have all those bits, but logically that's it. And some of the terminology is a little bit unfortunate because we talk about solar panels, but we also talk about service panels, and they're completely different things, right? Solar panels up on your roof, service panels is the circuit breaker box, and it just, there's no relationship to the two, but it still uses the word panel. Or junction box. The junction box that's on the back of the solar panel is where the wires are connected, but then those wires connect to a junction box, which is on the roof. So we're using terminology. You'd think they could come up with different stuff, but they don't. So the junction box is on the back of the panel. Inside that junction box are typically going to be your bypass diodes. Remember, I think we touched on those in one of the previous chapters. They're usually 3. It basically is splitting up the solar panel into 3 different strings of cells so that if one string is affected, it doesn't affect the whole panel. So if you do have a problem, you might want to pop open that junction box and see if one of those diodes has been blown out. If you get a power surge or something like that, that's where it's going to show up. That's sort of a weak piece of wiring in the system. So if for some reason if a solar panel is only generating 2/3 of what it should, maybe it was just a diode that blew out, you can replace the panel. Probably that's your first choice because these things are under warranty. Or if you're one of those who loves to tinker, you can just go and buy for 5 cents a little diode and you can solder it in there. Of course, then you voided your warranty. So if you ever have to turn it in. Then there's MC4 connectors. MC4 is a generic term, but it's a product specific term. It's sort of like how we use the term Kleenex. It's a really one company owns it, but we just refer to a whole thing of facial tissues as Kleenex or Xerox, those kind of things. So not every MC4 is comparable to every other MC4, even though we call them MC4 connectors. I think it's Straub, the German company, that has the true MC4. That's their trademark, but they were one of the first, and we just use that term. One of the leading causes of fires in system installs is mismatched MC4 connectors. They've got little interior barrels that are supposed to connect up with each other. If they don't match exactly, you can get some arcing going on in there. It's hidden from view. So oftentimes, I know Amazon did a big study where they had a bunch of fires, and when they looked at it, it was like 90% of them were just mismatched MC4 connectors. So make sure you're using the proper connector when you're making a jumper, because when you're up on the roof, you're oftentimes going to make some jumpers. Take the connector. I got to go from one end of the array over to the junction box. I can't just go straight in. I've got to make a jumper that's going 30 feet or whatever. We do that all the time. We'll do it in the lab. Make sure the connectors you're using match the connectors on the panels. Sometimes when you buy panels, I've seen this with some of the larger systems, like every fifth or sixth panel, they're going to tape an extra connector on the back of the panel. So as you're unloading them, you get a big pile of these sort of spare connectors. That's nice because now you've got the same exact connector that came with that. In case there's a damaged connector and you have to fix it, or in case you need to make a jumper, it's going to be right there. But the panel spec is going to tell you what connector it has. Make sure your connectors match. Okay. Combiner box and junction box, really the only difference between the two is a combiner box, you make a parallel connection. That's all. So it used to be that we would leave a solar array. Well, let me go ahead and jump into the whiteboard here again. So in the good old days of design, we would have, let's say, a solar array up here. I don't know why that's not wanting to go. There we go. All right, so that's my array. And let's say I've got 3 strings and I'm going into a combiner box. Well, in a combiner box, these strings are now going to be connected in parallel, and then I'm going to leave here and I'm going to go to my DC disconnect. Normally, my DC disconnect is built into my inverter. And I might have a DC disconnect up on the, whoa, somebody's drawing on there. Where's all that coming from? All right. Somebody's got some wires there. Whoa, I don't want that. Are you guys seeing those lines?
It's me, Jay. Apologies, I touched the screen.
Okay.
Not intentional.
Cool. All right, great. All right, so if we've got our inverter here, so what has just happened? Well, I've made a connection in here. I've made these, and oftentimes in these old combiner boxes, you might have 3 circuit breakers in here. So now we've made a parallel connection. We've connected the positives to the positives, negatives to the negatives, and now we're going to leave with just one set of negative and positive. All right, that's great. It saves some wire. Problem is when it comes to your MPPT. Remember the MPPT, the maximum power point tracking of this system. So at this point, the minute we made that as a parallel connection, now the entire array is behaving as a single unit. So if I get shading over here, it's going to affect the whole thing. Whereas if I kept these things as individual strings, as in a junction box, I might have 3 strings going to my DC disconnect. Well, then shading over here only is going to affect 1/3 of our array. That's assuming that our inverter has 3 MPPT connectors, connection points, which is not that unusual in today's market. Okay, it'll also affect voltage drop. So let's say, for instance, that we've decided this is 180 feet from here, and each of my strings, let's just say it's a 9.2 amps, is the VMP for each string. Well, if I combine them, so I only have one string coming out of there. Okay, so if it's 9.2, well, when we go to do voltage drop, and this is our, it's now we're going to take times 3, right? Because we're making a connection. So 3 times 9.2 is 27.6, right? Amps. And it's going here, and it's 180 feet. So voltage drop equals amps times resistance times twice the distance divided by 1,000 feet. So amps is now 27.6 times, let's say that it's number 10 wire. I always use that because I have that resistance memorized. It's 1.24 ohms. And we said 180 feet, so that's 360 divided by 1,000, or 0.36. So we can take this 27.6 times 1.24 times 0.36, and we just lost 12.3 volts. All right, 12.3 volts. Well, let's say that this array was 30 panels, so it's 3 strings of 10, and the system itself, the panels, the VMP, is, let's just say, 32.6 volts. So 10 times 36.2 is, or 32.6 is going to be 326. So my system is 326 volts because I hook them up in 3 strings of 10 is just how I'm configuring this. So what's my voltage drop? It's 12.3 divided by 326. That's almost 4%. So that's not acceptable. So I would need to put in a bigger wire. But if I was doing 3 strings like that, well, then instead of 27.6, it's still just 9.2 amps. So now my number is going to be a third of that. If it was almost 4, or almost 4, now it's just a little over 1, which is probably acceptable. So having 3 strings of 10 gauge wire versus 1 string of, I don't know, 6 gauge wire, who knows? The costs may be similar, but also I'm getting better performance from my array, because a third of it, if it's shaded, is only affecting a third. Hopefully, I know I'm jumping over this, and this is really supposed to be just the highlight items. So hopefully all of that makes sense. Okay, any other questions? I don't want to get into the ampacity yet. We'll start that next week. If you'll just remind me, we'll talk about how you size based on, but that diagram on page 111 is going to be something you use all the time when you're sizing wire. And I will give you a little bit of a hint. If you look at in your book on page 111, and in this table, the left-hand column is all the different wire sizes. And then the next column, the second column, is the ampacity maximums for low temperature wire. That's wire that's rated for 60 degrees Celsius, which is a pretty high temperature, but it's low temperature as far as wire is concerned. And then there's ampacity for medium wire and then high temperature wire. Okay, so those 3 columns. Well, when we make the decision when we're designing our system is only look at the low temperature wire column. Don't worry about middle or high temperature wire. And the reason for that, I'll go back to the whiteboard here, is in any circuit, let's say I'm connecting from my junction box here, and I'm going here to my DC disconnect. And I'm going to be connecting this point to that point. Okay. Well, I've just determined the ampacity rating of the wire. And let's say I'm using PV wire or use 2 wire, which is in the third column. It's high temperature wire. So I could, in theory, use those ampacities. And if you look at that column, 10 gauge wire, high temperature wire can handle 40 amps, but low temperature wire can only handle 30 amps. So I might be tempted to say, okay, well, I can handle 40 amps. No problem. Problem is this little bolt that I'm connecting to and this little bolt or bus bar or wherever I'm connecting to also has a temperature rating. And I don't necessarily know what that is. So it's not going to be less than the column 1, that's 60 Celsius. And it might be 90 degrees Celsius. It might be. I don't know. But unless I'm certain that all 3 of those bits, where connected in this box, the wire itself, and where connected in this box, are rated for high temperature, I can't use that high ampacity rating. So because this box might be switched out in the future, or I might not have that information, we'll just always assume the worst case scenario. So we'll always read from that left-hand column. So that's just going to make life safe, right? So you may have to use a little bit bigger wire than you might use otherwise, but it's going to, again, protect you for this stuff. The biggest critical error that people make is putting in too small a wire. So we're going to keep erring on the size of bigger wire. It's going to cost you a little bit. And of course, in today's world, it's going to cost you, a fair amount. But still, your system's going to work. So that's the main thing. If you're spending 20 or 30 grand on a solar array system for a home, let's not worry about $200 or $300. Let's make sure we got the wire. So sort of like skimping on the foundation of a house, don't do it. So, because everything else rests on it. Okay, so I think I've covered the bits I wanted to cover here. Anybody have any question before we adjourn? You guys are all so quiet and meek. All right. Okay, so I'll see you guys next week. Actually, I'll be connecting in from England. I'm going to be over there, so it'll be evening for me and daytime for you. Okay, so I'll see you next week. All right, take care.
Thanks, Jay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.